everybody, and hi, Advertising Week. We are so excited to talk about the next era of programmatic. Before we jump in, let's do a quick round of intros. My name is Barry Bucci. I'm the Senior Director of Trading and Strategic Partnerships at Ampersand. Dan Callahan, why don't you do a quick intro?
Absolutely. Good morning. Dan Callahan, SVP of Data Strategy and Sales Innovation at Fox, which is really just a fancy way of saying I oversee our advanced TV, addressable, and programmatic business.
Tom Kershaw, you're up next.
Oh, hi, I'm Tom Kershaw. I'm CTO here at Magnite.
Paul Ryan.
Hi, glad to be here. Paul Ryan, CTO of OpenX.
And Harry Cargman.
Hi, I'm Harry Cargman. I'm the founder and CEO of Cargo, and I nominate Paul Ryan's background with his books as the best background of the five of us.
I appreciate that, Harry.
Stacks and stacks.
Stacks and stacks, yes.
So we're here to talk about the next era of programmatic. So let's jump in. Programmatic has become part of a traditional media plan, more mainstream, but there are still concerns, for example, with regards to transparency. Where do you think these gaps are, and what are some steps that we can take to fix them? I'll kick it off to you, Dan, to kick this one off.
Awesome. Thanks, Barry. Excited to be with this great panel and discussing these important topics. You know, transparency is key to what Fox has always delivered. Knowing what content you're running against, what audience you're reaching, and what device you're running on are majorly important to advertisers. And I think that programmatic, as it turns the corner into this next era, we all have to come together to raise the bar of what's measured, how it's measured, and how it's reported upon. For a while, we've raced to what I would define as the lowest common denominator of an impression, that isn't fully viewable and isn't completed, and we can do better than that. So I hope in this next era, we increase transparency and accountability in the way media is measured and transacted through programmatic channels.
Great. What does Paul? Do you have anything to add?
No, I love those sentiments. I mean, transparency, so you actually understand what you're paying for, what's the consumer that you have, and so on and so forth. I think in the programmatic ecosystem, however, there's so many different players, and actually combining that data turns out to be an incredibly hard task, especially when you have different tiers of the stack that have antithetical sorts of goals. Publishers typically want to make the most money. Brand marketers want to spend potentially the least money, and so on and so forth. So I think that we're all on board as an industry, and there are tons of industry initiatives to make things completely transparent. However, there's lots of adoption costs, meaning there's lots of people across the industry. That's how it's so different from the walled gardens, where they define transparency for you and you get what you get. At least in the programmatic ecosystem, we're actually working to try to make this open and transparent as an overall industry. I'm sure, Tom, you would like to chat a little bit about how pre-bid, for example, is part of that initiative.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the biggest challenges for transparency is that we're all talking the same language. I mean, we all have different terms for different things. And so everyone's got these like fancy log file initiatives where here's all my data. Look, you can see everything that we're doing. And then the data means something different depending which company is producing it. That's a big problem. And so, pre-bid is trying very hard to create standards for how we define what we're doing in the industry. And an example is there still is no standard for identifying an ad slot, right? So you have different labels for a specific ad slot up and down the ecosystem. And how could you even tell, which slot you're talking about? So I think getting to standardization around our taxonomy is a pretty big thing that pre-bid's trying to take on. And the whole entire industry really needs to embrace, standardizing our language.
So
yeah,
that's
so important. I mean, we were chatting a little bit about viewability. Like, viewability should be by ad slot. But if an ad slot isn't defined across all of the exchanges in the demand tier, what is it then? right? Is it all the placements on a whole site can be one ad slot? And so that doesn't make any sense from a viewability point of view. So these little standards that aren't, I mean, a lot of them have been promulgated, but haven't been necessarily implemented across the ecosystem, can destroy something as simple as viewability. Can actually someone see the ad? So I'm sorry I interrupted there, Barry.
No, you're fine. Harry, I want to turn this question to you. Since you sit on both sides of your demand partner and a publisher, how do you think publishers need to evolve in order to adapt to a more standardization? And actually, I'm going to throw in another topic about the world without cookies, because I think standardization around viewability, as well as what we're going to go through without cookies in the future, is really important here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and really interesting topic, and I love the level of knowledge of this group. I think the group shares so many different aspects and understanding of what the industry is. Here's what I'll share. With regard to transparency, what I think the market misses is that ultimately there's a slot that's getting auctioned and you have to win the slot. So everybody is obsessed with transparency around price or cost of the ecosystem. But when you add in all the different parts and costs of all the different players, whether it's a data cost or a middle cost of, for example, if there's a third party like an index exchange or IPON Web that has an incremental cost, and then there's the SSP cost, the DSP cost, you add those all in, plus viewability and a few other things. What you realize is that ultimately all of that together has to win that slot in an auction against somebody else bidding for that exact same slot. And so transparency around pricing takes care of itself, or should take care of itself, because if your cost structure is too high and in too many people participating in the actual take on that particular media dollar, ultimately that will be priced into the auction and you will lose, and then you can sort of understand why your media cost isn't higher with a higher win rate. So that's the first thing that I think will be interesting from a publisher side of things. On the other side of things, which is what the publishers need to focus on, and I think you're starting to get at with the cookie, if the entire ecosystem is set up around buying an individual user, and that user is no longer able to be identified because cookies is the primary way for people to identify audience, then the programmatic ecosystem has to start trading on different measurement metrics and has to start targeting different things in the ecosystem which aren't there. What we see is folks like the Trade Desk with their new standards around identity 2.0. What you will see is that it's still an attempt by publishers to get logged in users, which may or may not happen in the short term. And so the question is, are there other signals that the algorithms inside of the DSPs can start to activate against? And how do we come together as an industry to identify what those signals are, whether they're contextual signals, whether they're sentiment-based signals, whether there are ways to sort of create segments and audience that are based upon the pages themselves and what can be identified in the page if it's not a cookie. And I think that's the future of programmatic going forward, when there's so much uncertainty as to whether we're going to be able to create the next form of identity, and whether publishers are going to be successful at getting consumers to sign up and to log into their site. New York Times has been very successful on that front, and so has the Wall Street Journal and other places. But I think it's going to be hard, broad strokes across the internet, to get somebody to actually want to sign into an account to watch, some little small video or something that was sent to them. And so I think that's going to be the challenge going forward as we see 2021 and 2022 play out.
Does Dan, do you have anything to add to that, being at Fox, from a Fox perspective?
Yeah, I think Harry touched on a lot of great topics. I mean, building a closer, more intimate relationship with our audience has been a key component of our strategy. The introduction of Tubi to the portfolio only broadens that, and the great number of monthly active users they have. I think they've recently crossed 30 million. So we're hopeful and optimistic that our content does prompt that login, that relationship, building that data file of known and logged in users to understand our audience and allow our advertisers to match against it, whether that's in a direct or programmatic fashion, is where I believe the industry's headed. And I think Fox is in a perfect position to take advantage of it.
All right.
I mean,
So
I have a couple of quick things. At the risk of mixing metaphors, we're really not talking about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is from an identity point of view, we're really talking about the browsers and all the initiatives that are going on right now in terms of privacy for users, whether it be Google Chrome and the announcement that third-party cookies at some time in the future will not be supported. Basically how Safari and Firefox and a whole variety of web browsers have been acting. We've seen the recent discussions with Apple and privacy and the reduction in addressability of individual users there. And so fundamentally, this is an industry in transformation where there's lots of people trying to get their identity solution out there that's resilient to the loss of basically how all targeting has worked, which is MAIDs, which are mobile device IDs, as well as cookies. And that transformation is going to be very, very choppy. There's no inherent winner. And so you really have to support a whole variety of approaches to address, to support one-to-one marketing. I would posit that one-to-one marketing is not going to go away on the open web and the mobile ecosystem. So it has to transform into something which is definitely more privacy compliant, but that will still allow publishers to monetize their content. Because frankly, that's how they make money. Publishers and app developers. I mean, so there's lots of initiatives. We mentioned the Trade Desk, Unified ID V2O. There's lots of companies trying to get their first-party identifiers out there through things like authentication. And I think taking a more agnostic approach where you're supporting stuff that's privacy compliant, frankly, the way pre-bid, and we're working on a pre-bid, is probably the way to go. But I'm sure Tom's going to correct me on this momentarily.
No, I mean, I agree, Paul. I think that there's going to be a set of cases where we pass identities to buyers and buyers take those identities and do magical things and segments are created and, bliss occurs. There will also be cases where publishers are creating segments using publisher data and are passing predefined anonymized segments to buyers. Both of these cases are going to be important because the whole internet is not going to go one direction or the other. To Harry's point, there will be a group of consumers that opt in to tracking and want to pass IDs, but not all publishers will want to pass those IDs to buyers in all cases. If you look at CTV today, there's a lot of cases where buyers are buying segments or spots or different ways of packaging up users. The important thing is to get the performance and the marketing, bang for your marketing dollar that people are looking for.
So
is everyone hearing that crow? That's a little ominous, isn't it?
Well, we are in Halloween land, right? This is October.
I'm just like,
so I like the sound effects.
Comment. Yeah, that's awesome.
Well, so speaking of video and talking about OTT and CTV, do you think that video will or should follow the same path as display for programmatic? What is that trajectory like for video in a programmatic world? Dan, gonna throw that back to you.
Video is 99% of what Fox does. So we live it, breathe it on a daily basis. I don't think it goes the way of display, right? It got to the point in display where advertisers could just add units to their page. Publishers had 6 or 7 display billboards there. Video to me is always going to be defined in some sort of cadenced, potted formats. What we do with live and long form, there are those scheduled breaks. Now, we are going to evolve those breaks, shorten them, do different creative executions and innovations where we can. But, there's always going to be that premium video play. So I'm hopeful that as the long tail gets cut, maybe as the cookie goes away, brands and agencies are going to find the value in this budding long form and live video environment that, was growing before the pandemic and has only taken off since. So my hope is that there is more valuable inventory around the corner in this next era. And, maybe we can get away from some of the short form and display stuff and move into the future.
Tom, do you have anything to add with all that Magnite's doing from a video perspective?
Yeah, we constantly have this debate. Does CTV follow the trajectory already set out by display, or does it take a different path? And I think that inevitably it will follow a very similar trajectory. I remember like 5 years ago, someone at a major news site telling me, there's no way that programmatic will ever come anywhere near the sponsorship revenue we get today from display. It's zero probability that would ever happen. And 3 years later, programmatic CPMs were much greater than that of traditional sponsorships. So I do think that things will move towards more and more automation, more and more data-driven results. And we won't necessarily transact everything in some combination of direct and PMPs. So I think ultimately these things will converge, but certainly CTV has different needs and different requirements because of the way it's set up. So there'll be a little bit of both, but I think ultimately the marketing world will come together, and marketers will be more interested in finding users where they want to be than they are the specific formats they happen to be consuming.
Bring up a good point, and I want to dig in a little bit right there about how video currently, it almost seems as if they sit on their own islands where it's mainly transacted through private deals. Is there some convergence of programmatic systems in the future for video, or do we think that this is just going to continue to be a little bit of a siloed approach, at least for the foreseeable future?
It's going to stay siloed for the foreseeable future, that's for sure. The current environment is fairly inventory constrained, and video transacts largely in private marketplaces and in direct sold. And that's going to stay the case because of the specific, the podding challenges, the competitive separation challenges, the lack of standardization or what content categories mean. There's just a lot of pipes issues that needs to be cleaned up and automated before we'll really be able to get to pure scale for video.
And I also think that there's historically historically what I think is interesting is that the video comes from the upfront world. And so how things get bought historically with regard to video, things get bought out in the upfront. There's an alignment against the content of the actual show. There's a desire for addressability in video, but that's like a new methodology for an approach. And I think if you're a existing video provider, like a Fox or a Disney or a NBC, the ability for you to sort of construct video with both linear and addressable in the future, I think is going to be the new normal. It's not going to be that you're going to throw all of your video into a programmatic exchange and then expect it to transact against audience behaviors. I think that it's going to have to be a hybrid, at least to start. And maybe the scatter market will become more programmatic-like, but all the good stuff will be reserved, very similar to the upfront going forward. So I think that's I think how it's going to look, because that seems to be the historical nature of how video has been bought in the past.
I was just going to add one quick thing on that. We also have to remember video. You're talking about pretty high CPMs compared in the programmatic universe. So because they're high CPMs, you can actually afford the cost of curation, right? Where brand safety and what sorts of players do you want to be in? What sorts of content do you want to provide there? So in a sense, because of that high CPM and the take rates across the ecosystem, you can afford to be a lot more careful as opposed to an open auction. That's not necessarily true for all parts of the programmatic ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think we lost display a little bit. I think there was such an obsession around identity and user targeting that there was a loss of contextual alignment in the display side. It sort of ran away. And then the strategy of most brands, because it got so large in terms of inventory types and there wasn't a way to track the good stuff from the bad stuff contextually, what's happened is there was sort of these layering of fraud and keyword and sort of segment based, and so it created a sort of a misalignment with content. And then you saw the articles that you saw in the New York Times last year, where it's like we've cut from 30,000 sites down to 1,000, and that's enough. I think that sort of realignment of context and sort of valuing display will hopefully be something that the industry embraces going forward in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. It's a complement of content and audience. It's not an all or nothing strategy, but what's the right mix of contextual adjacencies with audience targets? Even in the sessions this morning, we heard that accountability on those spends and those ad dollars is going to be a requirement. So the hope there is that, publishers that are granting transparency, allowing the targeting, kind of bringing those pieces together in the right forms and packages, hopefully this will favor them near term and long term.
All right. Well, so you touched on something about it's a mixture of contextual and audience-based. With regards to audience-based, going back to how we need to adapt to a world without cookies, and we kind of touched upon this, but I want to bring this up again about evolving. Do we think that we need to evolve, or publishers need to evolve to be more like those walled gardens in order to really see the scale in a post-cookie world? I know mentioned the signals from another signal, but until that's determined, how do you see the immediate world without cookies going for us to be able to scale in a more audience-based approach?
Yeah, I think, the question is, what is the new standard? Right now, the algorithms are all trained around identity. Identity, it drives the market and the valuation of that impression. Viewability on some level does as well, where the ad slot and the viewability of the ad slot drives some of that, but that's usually post-auction where you're evaluated on the quality of the viewability. But I think going forward in the future, what's going to be critical is there a way to convince marketers that not all impressions are equal, and that there are impressions on content types that are more valuable because it aligns better with the messaging, gets higher click-through rates or engagement rates, drives more attention? Are there publishers that drive more attention ultimately than other publishers or other placements? And I think that evolution is really what Jonah from Mode originally was thinking about, and we only got to viewability as that first level. But that evolution of the value of the impression is where the market has to go. And so there's going to be innovation in that area. I'm sure that the Magnite guys, OpenX, we are doing it. A lot of the high-end, high-impact guys are doing it. A lot of the content providers and publishers are focused on it. And how do you create a new set of standards around quality of inventory that can be either standardized under the IAB or can be provided under a walled garden basis, where you can bring a offering to the marketer where they get super excited because you've unlocked some special sauce and can prove that you're either driving more engagement, higher purchase intent, or even more foot traffic because you're able to create a set of impressions or pattern of impressions for them from their media that they can't get anywhere else.
I think that's an important point, because whenever we talk about identity in this industry, we spend all of our time talking about targeting, and not enough about attribution. One of the biggest use cases for an identifier is being able to determine the outcome of the message, not necessarily where the message is displayed. So I think that that's a really important point. We should spend more time talking about attribution. But the one thing I would say is, no, it is not the role of the independent web to emulate the walled gardens. The role of the independent web is to reinvent the internet in a way that is more conducive to what consumers want and what advertisers need. And copying the walled gardens is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be tearing those things down.
Hear, hear, Tom. Hear, hear. I think what's difficult about what we're chatting about here is, just think of the concept of the trading desk on the buy side, right? You're trying to get the best deal on undervalued inventory, okay? But if you have to share the conversion and the attributions and then conversions, that's a little bit antithetical to that. So let's not forget that there are economic factors at odds within this ecosystem that in a sense make it harder to come up with industry-wide standards.
Isn't that the very core of this industry? Is everything is always opposing one another?
No, it is. But I mean, we launched a product a while back called Open Audience, where attribution is an incredibly important part of what we need to do to understand the audiences we're creating. And it's pretty gosh darn hard to get, right? Because as soon as you get information on conversions or potentially attributions to conversions, then the presumption is on the buy side, we're just going to raise prices, right? And so it's an interesting dance. I think that requires everyone to comprehend that the ecosystem has to thrive in order for all of us to make money.
Well, I mean, I think we need a part two, because we did not jump into attribution and we can continuously go IC for hours, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I want to thank you all for joining me this morning. And thank you, Advertising Week 2020. This has been wonderful. Hope everyone has a wonderful week too.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.